Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Wescott. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Faculty of Education at Monash, and I'm going to be performing your lecture for this week in what would have been week 5 in a non-COVID world. But the topic for today is teaching English in a multilingual, multicultural Australia. I've put my contact details on this title page here. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have after today, after this lecture, so please get in touch. There's my email address there and my Twitter handle as well. What I want to do first before we begin is I just want to give you a warning that I will mention some confronting topics in this lecture. It's always good practice when you're dealing with difficult topics, as we often do in the English classroom. It's good practice to make sure that everyone in the room is safe and okay with what's being discussed, and also to try and conclude the discussion on not necessarily a positive note, but in a way that just ensures the well-being of everyone in the room. Obviously, I can't do that today, and I don't know you and I don't know your histories. So I just want to let you know that if this is heavy for you, then please reach out for some help if you need to talk to someone. So I want to talk a little bit now about my teaching history. I was an English teacher and a history teacher in a government school in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne. This photo was taken on one of my last days teaching in that school before I became a full-time candidate. This photo is with a number of students who I taught. These students were and are very, very special to me. I loved them very much, and I was profoundly changed after teaching these young people. These students are refugees from Myanmar. They're an ethnic minority from a small part of Myanmar called Chin State, and they are survivors of genocide. And my school historically had been a white Anglo-Saxon school for its entire history, pretty much, until, I'd say probably 6 or 7 years ago, when asylum seekers and refugees began settling in the area. And the cultural makeup of our school changed drastically, really quickly. So I learned a lot, and the school learned a lot from that experience, and we had to learn, and our students had to learn. There was a lot of really problematic attitudes in our school population that we needed to address through our curriculum, through our pastoral care, and just through our relationships that we had with all the students in the school. So some of what I'll share today comes from what I learned as a teacher during that time. Some of it is just what is known as good practice in teaching in multilingual and multicultural classrooms. But some of it is just about how to be the person, or how to be the teacher that your class needs. And that's something that you will learn with time and with practice. But yeah, I just wanted to begin with this photo because this is my starting point for what I'm going to be talking about today. So my experience is teaching refugee students, and I'll talk about why that distinction needs to be made when we're talking about multicultural, multilingual classrooms. Another thing that I want to begin with is this quote. This is from a research paper that was written by an organisation called Foundation House. Foundation House are the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Trauma. For survivors of torture. They do a lot of work with schools and school communities in supporting refugee and asylum seeker students. The organisation is made up of social workers and counsellors, and there's a lot of really wonderful and useful resources on their website if you want to have a look. But this student participant in their research project said the following: "When someone came here last year, it's like a baby is born. They're 1 year old, and when they try to walk, his mum is going to take their hand and walk them through slowly. Same with teachers. If you help your students and explain to them, they'll improve in 1 month maybe because they're motivated. In any class, everything depends on the teachers. The way they teach the student matters. I chose this quote because it became the underpinning principle for my practice as a teacher, but also I should mention that I was a student wellbeing coordinator as well. So a big part of my role was working with young people, working with families and communities to ensure that young people were doing okay in the circumstances of their lives. And my philosophy in the classroom was always that students first, that everything that I did was guided by what was best for my students, and that what I did for them profoundly mattered, and that it was profoundly important that I did what was right for them. So some guiding questions for what I'm going to be talking about today are: who is in our classrooms in Australia? Who do we mean when we talk about multicultural students or multilingual students? I'm going to talk about how we can support our students through pedagogy in the English classroom, but also how we can use the space that we have, a really unique space in the English classroom, to cultivate tolerance in Australian school populations, and also how an English classroom can be a space for young people to heal. So when we talk about diversity in Australian classrooms, we're talking about a range of possible types of diversity, and of course many of these intersect with one another. As a few examples, we might be talking about racial, ethnic diversity, neurodiversity, religious, cultural, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic, age, ability, bodily, language and literacy, and political. Today, mostly I'm focusing on race, ethnicity, cultural, and then as a product of those types of diversity, language and literacy diversity, and then how our classrooms need to respond to that. So you may have students in your classroom who are multicultural, multilingual students. They may be, or they may not be, considered EAL students. When we talk about EAL students, we mean students for whom English is an additional language. It may be their second, third, fourth, or fifth language. And it's likely that you will have students who fit this criteria in your classroom. Now, the Department of Education considers students to be EAL for a limited number of years after their arrival in Australia. So usually when a student arrives here, either they're a migrant, a refugee, or an asylum seeker, they'll spend about a year in an English language school specifically before they then transfer to the age-appropriate class that they are supposed to be in the Australian system. So the thing to know about EAL learners is that they are diverse. We're not talking about a single group of people with the same experience. Their needs therefore vary. What we need to provide for them is therefore specific to their circumstances. So you could have a student in your school who is classified as an EAL student who could fit any of the following circumstances. They might be beginning school in Australia at any year level. They could be starting at prep, they could be starting at year 11 in Australia. They may have been born overseas, or they may have been born in Australia. They may be beginning school with little, some, or no exposure to English. Although if they've been in an English language school, they will have had some experience. They may have the schooling equivalent to that their Australian peers have. So they may have had 9 years of education. They may have had little or no previous schooling in any country, or they may have had interrupted education in their first language. So when we talk about EAL students making progress in Australian schools, we want them to be learning to speak English. We want them to be learning to read and write in English. We want them to be continuing their learning in all areas through English at the same time that they are learning English, which I'm sure, as you can imagine, is an extremely difficult thing to do, particularly because when we are learning a new language, we don't master academic language, academic English, for a number of years. It takes a very long time. And these students may also be learning about the Australian school system and how it works. It might be very different to the school system that they were exposed to in their previous country, if they were part of an education system at all. So an additional group within the category of EAL students might be students who are refugees or asylum seekers, and they have specific needs that are additional to the needs of EAL students or students who are Australian born. So students who fall under this category may have had a disrupted education, so they may have spent long amounts of time in camps or in detention centres. These students may have experienced incredible trauma in their lives, and I'll explain later in this lecture why that's important to know. They may have experienced violence, torture, and loss. They may have been deprived of food, shelter, health services, and security. They may not be literate in their native language. So that complicates things when a student is trying to learn to be literate in a second or third or fourth language. They may have experienced loneliness and isolation and racism and discrimination, and those experiences may be ongoing for them after they arrive in Australia and begin school. The table on the right-hand side of this slide is also from Foundation House, and it identifies things called protective factors. So when we're talking about protective factors, we mean things that a person can experience that enhance their well-being. And then we have risk factors, which are things that are detrimental to a person's well-being. If you look down to the very last box on the left-hand side, protective factors for people arriving in Australia are a good health system, information, which can come via the legal system, the health system, and the education system. Another protective factor, and this is something that is really important, is the participation in education. So we know that for young people who are refugee and asylum seekers, school is a protective factor. School is something that enhances their well-being. And that's actually true for all young people, and particularly our very vulnerable young people in Australia, whether they're asylum seekers, refugees, or Australian born. So that's something that's really important to remember. Being at school, belonging to a school, being part of its culture, its community, its routine, and its stability and security can be very healing for young people. So here are some voices from young people who are in schools in Australia, coming from a project completed by Foundation House. So I thought it would be good to centre these voices in this lecture today, so we have a sense of what our students in our classrooms might be experiencing. So I'm going to read these out and just let you sort of sit with them, just so you have some sort of understanding of what the young people in your class might be experiencing, or maybe not. This might not represent the experiences of every student, obviously, but it's just still something to think about. If I'm only learning English for a short amount of time, I think it's good to give me the easy work first, then see how I'm going. In the refugee camp, they never use computers, but here they give the computer to you to take back home, but never teach you how to type. He, Joe, will be very shy and nervous or scared to come and ask the teacher and ask for help. For some people, they get really angry when they don't understand something. They feel like they are below everyone. It's hard because even when you go and ask, they're explaining in English, so you get more confused. So we don't want to go anymore and ask. They, teachers, try really hard, but we're still stuck. So what I hope to offer in the remainder of this lecture is some ways that we can address some of the problems that these students are bringing up. So these problems are around the accessibility of work, the support that they're receiving from the school with new things, but also some of the cultural practices that inhibit asking for help from a teacher. Or sometimes when you're a teacher, you think what you're doing is really good practice and that it's suitable, that it's pitched correctly, and a student will be silent or they'll be nodding and you think, great, perfect. I've nailed this. But actually, it's not working at all for them. So I want to tell a story about an experience that I had in the classroom that was an important learning experience for me as a teacher of a multicultural classroom. So in Year 11 English, our school decided that we were going to teach The Handmaid's Tale. This was before HBO decided to make a series of it. So it was before it had a cult following. For anyone who doesn't know the story of The Handmaid's Tale, it's a dystopian fiction novel. It was written in the 80s. It's set in the future, but we don't precisely know when that is. The setting is in America, but America has been taken over by a dictator. It's a theocracy. There's been an environmental disaster, and the women are no longer able to, the women are no longer fertile. So the women who are fertile are given the role in the society as handmaids and sent to produce children for families of particular status in the society. So I'm in this Year 11 English classroom, and I've got to teach this book that is hugely confronting. There's so many difficult topics. So we're talking about an autocratic government, human rights abuses, which I know that students in my class have experienced before in their lives. We're talking about rape and violence coming up often in this text. So I had to think really carefully and really strategically about how I was going to teach this text in a way that was safe for all the students in the classroom, but also in a way that was accessible, because it's dealing with some really hard topics. So some things that I had to take into consideration were cultural sensitivities. So I had students in my class who, because of their religious faith, had not had any kind of exposure to some of the language of this text, some of the concepts of this text. So I had to be really aware that I was the first one bringing these things up for them in class, possibly. So something for me to remember was students' varying levels of exposure to some of the very advanced and explicit content of this book. Something I also had to be aware of was that the Australian-born students in my classroom had no personal experience of living in a dictatorship and experiencing or having, your human rights taken away and having violence perpetrated against you by your government. Whereas some of the other students in my classroom had recent and personal experience with those things. Ultimately, this is sort of promoted as a feminist text, which sort of looks to how governments can slowly erode women's rights from under their noses. So in the classroom, I was also aware that I was possibly going to encounter some challenging belief systems and attitudes about the role of women in society, the role of women in the house and in the marriage. So I knew that I was going to encounter some disagreement in my class about what that role should be, and that students' understanding of the role of women is something that's socially and culturally informed. So it was a very difficult thing to teach. We just took it really, really slow. We had lots and lots of discussion, and I absolutely didn't expect or ask students to draw on any kind of personal experience when we had our discussions, but some of them did. We did lots of quiet, unstructured, low-stakes writing. There was a lot of phrases, a lot of language that needed to be unpacked. So I'm not going to say that here is my 10 strategies for teaching a text like this, but my advice would be to be aware of who's in your room and what their history is, what they might bring to the text, whether it's a lot or nothing. And just to take your time, go really slow with this, and let the good experience be the desired outcome rather than the product, the essay or, whatever the assessment is. Let the process be the product. Another story that I have to tell is about a text that we decided to booklist called The Bone Sparrow, which is the experience of a child living in a detention centre. We made the decision to booklist this text because we knew that we had some misunderstanding in our school population about students who were arriving as refugees and enrolling in our school. A lot of our Australian-born students, because of the area where they lived, had not previously been exposed to any cultural diversity. They didn't necessarily understand what a refugee was or what it meant to be a refugee. So we had some decisions to make as an English team because we felt that it was our responsibility and that we had an opportunity in the English classroom to address some social attitudes. So we actually consulted our refugee students, and students in the older year levels, we gave them this text to read. We selected students who we knew would be okay with this, and we said, could you read this for us and tell us if you think that this would be okay to be taught at our school? Do you think you would have been okay with reading this? And the feedback they gave us was really good. So we book listed it, and the purpose of book listing this was to teach and practice empathy and understanding in our school population. We really had a lot of work to do in healing our really fragmented school. And this is, I suppose, where the English class the English curriculum can step in to do some of this work. And it's why we in our school became to really advocate for English as doing a lot of this social attitude kind of work. So it is really important, the decisions that the English faculty make about texts, for what reason, and then what you do with them. But that is always something to consider about what contribution English can make to what is going on in a school at any time. So I mentioned before that when we're teaching multicultural, multilingual students, that some of those students, depending on their history, may have had a really difficult time before they arrive in Australia, and then that difficulty can continue, of course, when they arrive in Australia. So it's important, and I'm just going to talk about this really quickly, but it can be an epiphany when you understand the impact that trauma in a young person's history has, the impact that has on their learning. It can really help you to understand your students. So a student who has had trauma in their history, that will often cause academic deficits. It can diminish their social skills. It can cause behavioural challenges. A traumatised student might find the classroom very challenging. It can cause disengagement with school. It's been linked to lower achievement, lower test scores and grades, higher rates of suspension, expulsion, and school failure. Schools can play a role in improving the lives of traumatised students. And I say can, because if it's going to work, it has to be done really carefully and really thoughtfully and in consultation with experts, people like Foundation House. So what I've spoken about when we decided to book list the text that I just spoken about, and when I was teaching The Handmaid's Tale, we were really consciously making decisions about how we could help to heal our school community. When you teach from the position where you understand who's in front of you and what they've experienced, it means that you show an awareness of how violence and victimization and other trauma can impact your students' lives, and you prioritize classroom safety. So this is just something that I would recommend taking into account when you do step into the classroom for the first time. You've got a hugely diverse class, you know vaguely perhaps what some of their histories are. Making your classroom safe, making safe choices about your pedagogy, which voices you're bringing into the classroom, which texts you're bringing into the classroom, that can really go a long way to healing whoever is in your classroom. Another thing that I would just add that I think I wanted to say before was that when students arrive in Australia and begin school, they're also, as well as being, refugees or asylum seekers, they're also teenagers. And we know that with teen years brings a lot of developmental challenges. So that's another thing to consider with the kids that you're teaching as well. Some things that we need to consider and perhaps interrogate when we make decisions about activities we're going to do in our classrooms are that, you know, when we choose things to set for our class, we have to be really careful about assuming that they're going to have access to the experiences and to the knowledge that we would assume they should have. So some mistakes that I made when I set tasks for my students was that I took my own life experience as a young person, remembered what it was like to be in year 7 or year 8, and thought they can probably access this work because I could at that age. It's not necessarily the case, and it seems like very naive of me to even have thought that. But even when we set really basic tasks like write a biography, write me a story about your holidays, what did you do? What was your weekend like? Draw me a family tree and explain a little bit about the people in your family. What we're not realizing when we set tasks like that is that not all students can access experiences that they are comfortable with to draw on for those tasks. They also might be thinking, well, my weekend or my holidays was really different to all these other kids who, you know, went down the coast or went camping. You know, I was looking after my grandma and going to church. So in a classroom that is diverse, we need to make sure that students are comfortable sharing their diverse experiences, but also make sure that we're not asking them to draw on experiences that might be difficult for them to articulate or that they're not ready to talk about yet. Another assumption we need to be careful of is that we know our students' lives. That, you know, I know that this student is from this particular background and therefore I know all of these things about what their life must be like, because it's just not true. So one recommendation that I have is to get to know your students as thoroughly and as early as you possibly can. Usually schools will provide you with some background information about your students, but often that's quite generalized and it doesn't necessarily take into account the individual person that you have in front of you. We can also assume that all classroom tasks are neutral or safe for all students, and that's related to the point that I made before about the kind of tasks that we set and the kind of resources that we expect that students can draw on to complete tasks. So that's something that I learned as a teacher in a diverse school, and it's something that I was constantly interrogating about myself and about the decisions that I was making. So I'd like to offer now some general strategies for teaching in a multilingual classroom. There are some things you can do that are specifically good for EAL students, but I'd also like to say that strategies that support students who are learning English are also good for all students. They're particularly good for students who have low literacy or for students who struggle academically. So anything that you do for your EAL students is not necessarily specific for them. So one thing that can be really helpful is using visuals to support written content and any verbal curriculum that you are delivering. So as a rule, I would try and make sure that I was giving instructions or content in at least 2 different modes, so that I had written and verbal, or I had visual and written. Another really good thing to do is to identify the language demands of the curriculum and provide some models or samples. So if you know that you're going to be expecting your students to write an essay or a creative piece or a paragraph, what can be really, really useful is for students to have an idea of what exactly you're looking for. Some schools call them model texts, but a sample essentially means the same thing. Using drama and role play to model language use. So when your students haven't yet developed the vocabulary to understand the concept that you're teaching, anything that you can do to perform what that might mean can be really helpful. Provide opportunities in the classroom for exploratory talk. That can be as a class, or it can be, turn to your partner and talk, or small group talk. It's also really important to allow students to speak in their preferred language when they're doing this type of talk. because often that's when they are able to make the most complex statements about what they think that they can then translate into English to share. Another thing that's really good to do is provide opportunities for talking before writing. Because if a student is stuck or not understanding or confused, if you give them an opportunity to talk to the people around them or to the person next to them, that can give them some confidence that they're on the right track before they begin writing. Another thing that's quite basic but really important is to provide some scaffolding for key phrases and structures. So things like sentence stems can be really useful for students who are learning English or for whom English isn't their first language. So you can give them the start of the sentence and the middle, or the start and the end. And then, you know, simplify that as they get stronger and more confident. They're just some things, but there are, and these are the ones that I found most useful and that I used most often, but there are many other suggestions out there. Another thing that's really important in the English classroom is representation in the texts that we teach. So as a school, we did an audit of our entire text list, and we were quite shocked. We realized that we had such poor diverse representation in the texts that we taught. And we realized how sad that was, that some of our students would go through their entire education and never read a character that was like them, or a character that they could connect with. So we overhauled our entire text list, and we made sure that we had diversity of all different kinds at every year level in every text. So here are some suggestions, and I know that these are taught in schools around Victoria, possibly Australia, I assume. But when you do start working in a school in an English faculty, if you're in a position and you feel comfortable to say, hey, how about this text? We don't have any of this type of representation, or how about we choose a non-white author, or we consider, you know, this particular type of film. I think it's really good, not only when you have students of a, you know, background other than English speaking, but also we made these decisions because we knew that it was also good for our Australian-born Anglo-Saxon students, that they needed to read more widely, because it became clear to us, as I've said, that their understanding and their capacity for intercultural understanding and empathy was quite limited. So representation really, really matters in the English classroom. Another thing to consider as well is when you make decisions about what your students are going to read, as in short texts like articles or opinion pieces or short videos, it's really good to ask yourself, which voices am I inviting into my classroom? Who am I showing my students has the authority to speak on particular issues? So just a few examples here of some Melbourne writers who are doing some really great work at the moment. Maxine Beneva-Clark, Nayuka Gori, and Hannah Asafiri are some good choices, but there are so many. And just on the left here, you know, we had this awful occurrence on Sunrise, which isn't unusual, obviously, because it's Sunrise. But, you know, 3 white Australians talking about Aboriginal adoption. It would actually be good to show your students this and get them to articulate what the problem is here and why voices matter, why representation matters. But yeah, it's really good to just sort of think about what are my own biases when I make decisions about whose voices I am including in my classroom, and do I need to change? So another element of this week's topic I know is differentiation. And I prefer to approach differentiation as a set of values or principles rather than approaches, because differentiation is student specific. It depends on who's in front of you and what they need. So I know that there are lots of strategies. There are hundreds and hundreds of strategies for differentiation, and they're important and useful. But I thought it would be better today for me to just talk about differentiation as an approach, or as a philosophy. So what I think is really important when you're thinking about what your students need is, first and foremost, you need to meet them where they are, not where they should be or where you assume that they are, but where they are on that particular day at that particular time. Another really important thing is to center student agency in differentiation. So ask your students how they're feeling, how they're going, where they want to be by the end of the year, and work with them to make that happen for them. So center your students' own voices in the tasks that you're setting for them and the learning that you're planning for them. Another thing that's really important to remember is that we are talking a lot in education at the moment about standards, about students meeting particular standards, being at standard or below standard. What that kind of talking assumes is that we expect all students to be the same, to be at the same point at exactly the same time. And for diverse classrooms, that's just not going to happen. So the expectation instead should be not that they'll all be the same, that the standard will be precisely identical, but that all students will grow. So if you establish that expectation with your students at the beginning of the year, that this is where you are now, let's talk about where we want you to be in 6 months' time. I think that's a much fairer way to think about it. Another good tip in differentiating for your kids is to teach up. So often when we talk about differentiation, you know, it can become sort of like simplifying or dumbing down. What a better approach is to actually be more aspirational about it. We believe and we know that all students can learn. So how do we make that happen for them? How do we provide opportunities, ladders of support, scaffolds, so that they can excel? And so that we can celebrate them and we can draw on what they have to offer and what's inherent and precious and good in them. So I'm going to finish on this, I think, and I have no idea how long I've been talking. But here are my key recommendations, the things that I learned from teaching a multilingual, multicultural student body. First and foremost, know your students, who they are as individuals. Obviously, take into account their history, what they've been, what they've seen, and what they've done, but who they are as a young person in your classroom is most important. Interrogate what you assume the students know or should know at any particular time, at any particular age. Consider if the activities you run enable equal access and inclusion. Are they fair for all students? Do they provide the same opportunity for all students in the class, regardless of what they bring to your classroom to participate? Practice running safe classroom discussions. So at the beginning of this, I tried to make this online Zoom lecture safe by recommending that some resources if you're struggling. It's inevitable that an English classroom will touch on difficult topics. It takes a little while to feel comfortable running those discussions. So if you have a go on placement, ask your mentor for some specific guidance and feedback. The best thing that I learned was that you should never finish a class on a devastating note or a sad note. I never wanted my students to leave the room feeling like they couldn't cope with what we just discussed. So always tie things together really neatly and leave things as safe as possible. Ensure diverse representation in the voices you amplify in your class. Choose the right people, the right voices to speak on the right topics. Recommend texts to your school with diverse characters and writers, and ask for guidance, ask for help. Ask the EAL teacher at your school for help. Ask the wellbeing team, ask your mentor. Go to the experienced teachers whose practice you admire and get their advice. It's always really useful. Here are the resources that I've drawn on today. But as I said at the start, if there's anything that you would like some more information on, or if you want to discuss anything, please get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to keep the conversation going. Thanks, Scott and Fleur, for inviting me on today. I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that it's useful. All the best with the rest of your year. All the best with your careers as English teachers. It's a wonderful, wonderful job, and I hope that you love it as much as I did. All the best.